Scholars view Douanel's Gnostic Church as an example of Neo-Catharism. However, some contemporary independent Catholic Gnostics find the term objectionable, preferring instead the restoration of Gnosis. As instructed by his seance contacts, Douanel formally established his church in 1890 and situated its liturgy and theology in Catharist doctrine and sacramental observances. Douanel penned numerous expositions on doctrine, including La Noce de Valentine, the Valentinian Gnosis, and Homilie Première, the first homily on the Holy Gnosis. Douanel's exposition on the complex and confounding Valentinian cosmology begins with the first creation of the Absolute was silence, the unnamed, the ineffable, the abyss, God. Silence contained two generators, male and female. These two are the root and the source of being. The Absolute, as love, contemplated itself with its eternal spouse, Enea, thought, wished for an object of its love. The abyss, the Absolute, through Enea, manifested the first two eons, Nous, divine intelligence, male, and Aletheia, truth, female. Simultaneously, the Absolute brings forth these eons, divine forces, in syzygies or pairs. Next, Nous and Aletheia emanated two more eons, Logos and Zoe, speech and life, who in turn gave birth to Anthropos and Ecclesia. Many more eons are engendered similarly. Sophia was the very last eon created, and thus the furthest from the Absolute. Subsequently, she felt great separation from the Absolute. To help Sophia, the Aeon Nous gave forth a new syzygy, Christ and Pneuma, Spirit. Sophia's great desire to be with the Absolute caused her to give birth to an eon called Achamoth, terrestrial Sophia. She, Achamoth, was cast out of the Pleroma, but as she fell, she caught a glimpse of the ineffable light that delighted her. Exiled into chaos, Achamoth was not allowed entrance into the Pleroma, which was guarded by the Aeon Horos, time. She cried, and her tears formed what we know as matter. Then the Aeon Horos, out of pity and concern for Achamoth, gave birth to the Aeon Jesus to be her companion. Redeemed by the influence of the Aeon Jesus, Achamoth emanated three elements, the pneumatic, the psychic, and the hylic. From these substances, Achamoth created the Demiurge, Greek for half-creator, who fashioned the material world, who Douanel calls the unconscious worker of the worlds below. The Demiurge consisted both of pleromic elements and a natural element. Satan is the eon of this world, birthed from matter, along with his minions, the perverse spirits. In order to oppose Satan, the Demiurge created man, but the Demiurge became jealous of man because Achamoth imparted a pneumatic spiritual seed to him. Then man disobeyed the Demiurge in the Garden of Eden and was cast out. In retaliation for this rebellion, the Demiurge caused man to crave pleasures that veiled the seed of light within him. Achamoth gave grace to humans to help them control the base sexual desires. Man is redeemed through the Aeon Jesus, who is not material, but formed of a psychic principle borrowed from the Demiurge and an astral body. The Aeon Christ works through the Aeon Jesus. Christ gave Jesus absolute power over Satan's world. Douanel describes three classes of human beings: the pneumatics, those elite humans who follow the light of Achamoth; the psychics, humans who exist somewhere between the realms of the Demiurge and of Achamoth; and the hylics, subject of Satan, whose soul is material and will be annihilated. While acting as patriarch under the name Tau Valentinus II, Douanel ordained both bishops and Sophias, female bishops, including a central figure of the French occult revival, Dr. Gerard Encausse, Papus, 1865 to 1916, who assumed the spiritual name Tau Vincent, Bishop of Toulouse. Along with Papus, Bishops Yvon Leloup, a.k.a. Paul Sédir, 1871 to 1926, and Lucien Chaumel, Tau Bardessan, died 1936, comprised the High Synod of the Church. In addition to his Masonic membership, Douanel joined Pappus's Martinist order in 1890 and eventually became a member of that society's Supreme Council. In 1892, Douanel consecrated several more bishops, including Parisian luminaries like symbolist poet Léonce Eugène Fabre des Essarts, Taus Synesius, 1848 to 1917, physician and occult scholar Louis Sophron Fougueron, Taus Sophronius, born 1848, and Marie Chauvel de Chauvigny, Esclermont, 1842 to 1924, the first female bishop of the church. Douanel declared that his church was in direct line to John the Beloved, just as Fabre Palaprat of l'Église Johanniste des Chrétiens Primitifs had done over 50 years before. In 1893, the Holy Gnostic Synod declared that St. John's Gospel was the sole Gnostic Gospel. Douanel's Gnostic Church combined the theological doctrines of Simon Magus, Valentinus, and Marcus, a later Valentinian noted for his development of the mysteries of numbers and letters and of the mystic marriage, with the sacraments derived from the Catholic Church and conferred in rituals that were heavily influenced by those of the Roman Catholic Church. At the same time, the Gnostic Church was intended to present a system of mystical masonry. From the outset, the Gnostic Church declared women and men to be absolute equals, ordaining both sexes to all clerical offices, and reflecting the Valentinian Gnostic philosophy. Fabre des Essarts addressed the issue of ordination of women. Woman is the equal of man, the indisputable pareidos of the anthropomorphic syzygy, and as such she has the right to exercise the fullness of the priesthood, and by means of this the vessel of infirmity, about which the Catholic Church speaks, becomes for, or within gnosis, the vessel of election. Douanel based much of his sacramental practice on what he conceived of as historical Cathar theology and praxis, as well as ancient Gnostic Christianity. Superficially, Douanel revived two historical Cathar sacraments, the Consolamentum and the Aperialamentum, spelled Aperialamentum by various scholars. Douanel also wrote a liturgy for a Gnostic Eucharist, La Fraction du Pain, breaking of the bread. In Douanel's version of the Aperialamentum, only a bishop or a Sophia may impart this sacrament of penance. After being petitioned for this sacrament, the penitent, who previously must have received the consolamentum at least once, met with the bishop at a pre-appointed time. This sacrament was only conferred in private. The supplicant, whose hands were bound with a white strip of cloth, knelt before the bishop and pled for pardon. The bishop then would lay his or her hands on the parishioner's head, offer words of comfort, and untie the binding cloth. The parishioner then recited the first verses of the Gospel of John and said, "God is love." The medieval Cathars' version of this sacrament was a monthly rite, a collective confession of faults by the perfect, gathered for the ceremony presided over by a deacon, or on certain special occasions, the bishop. After leading the newly constituted church for a number of years, Douanel abdicated his patriarchate in the Gnostic Church in 1895, to the great shock of his followers, and returned to the church of his youth, the Roman Catholic Church. Joining forces with Gabriel Antoine Jogan Pages, a journalist and publisher who used to pen the name Leo Taxil, the two published denunciations of the Masons, the Gnostic Church, and Martinism, all organizations in which Douanel had previously been active. The former Gnostic patriarch even went so far as to publish a virulent anti-Masonic book entitled Lucifer Démasqué, Lucifer Unmasked, under the pseudonym Jean Kostka. In 1897, a year after the publication of A.E. Waite's book debunking the Lucifer Démasqué, Taxil revealed that his entire anti-Masonic campaign was an intricate hoax designed to embarrass the Roman Catholic Church. Fabre des Essarts, known in the church as Taus Synesius, assumed the patriarchate after Douanel's exodus. Under his leadership, and with the assistance of Louis Sophron Fougueron, l'Église Gnostique de Francaise gradually changed into a church of Christian Gnosis instead of the explicitly Gnostic and Catharist Church of Douanel. Fabre des Essarts' newly fashioned church, l'Église Chrétienne Moderne, neo-Gnostique, supplanted Douanel's l'Église Gnostique de Francaise. When Douanel recanted and wished to be reconciled to the Gnostic Church in 1900, it was in this church that Fabre des Essarts reconsecrated him as Tau Jules. Part 4. Jean Bricaud and the l'Église catholique Gnostique. In 1901, Fabre des Essarts consecrated 20-year-old Johnny Bricaud, 1881 to 1934, as Tau Johannes, Bishop of Lyon, an act that would effect major changes in the church. In 1907, Bricaud left l'Église chrétienne moderne neo-Gnostique and with Pappas and Faugueron formed a new church that the three bishops christened l'Église catholique Gnostique. That same year, the young bishop who had been consecrated in the Johannine Church by Bishop Clement was also made Patriarch of the Johannine Church, which was discussed in Part 2 of this chapter. Bricaud is a similar figure in independent Catholic history, because in his person three discrete lineages come together: the historic episcopate through Villat's line, Douanel's mystically appointed priesthood, and the earlier French esoteric churches, including l'Église Johannite des Chrétiens Primitifs. Bricaud gave a homily on the occasion of his elevation to the patriarchal seat of l'Église catholique Gnostique, which he also refers to as the Holy Church of the Paraclete. Speaking to the gathered congregation, he preached that it was evident in the religious situation of the European people that Catholicism, as it is taught and understood at this time, does not meet the needs of modern society. Rather, it appears to most people as an oppressive force that dominates people by enslaving them in ignorance. In fact, he contended, if those religious people who dare to think of deserting the Church actually did so, it would portend the fall of Catholic orthodoxy. The Holy Church of the Paraclete, however, offers a new religion, that of Gnosticism. Gnosis is the complete and final synthesis of all the beliefs and ideas that humanity needs to realize its origin, its past, its end, its nature, its future, the contradictions of existence, and the problems of life. Gnosis is the pearl of the gospel for which humans really worthy of this name must sell all and give all to it. He further noted that, by the term Christianity, we do not understand it only to be the doctrines taught since the advent of the divine Savior, but those taught before his arrival in the ancient temples, the doctrines of eternal truth. Our church is different from that of Rome. The name of that church is force. The name of ours is charity. Our sovereign patriarch is not Peter, the impulsive one who 3 times disavowed his master, but John, the friend of the Savior, the apostle that rested on Jesus' heart and knew Jesus most intimately, the oracle of light, the author of the eternal gospel. From the episcopal pens of Bricaud and Faugueron came the Profession de foi, profession of faith, which affirms 12 points of belief of the new church. Their tripartite theology departs quickly from the Orthodox in describing the second member of the Trinity, the Son, Jesus, whose person became inhabited by the divine Word, proclaimed by the Ion Christos, that came down from the Pleroma. This descent took place at Jesus' baptism, and the Christos remained with Jesus until the moment of his passion. Through Jesus, the Christos instructed humans in gnosis and spiritual life, to deliver them from the slavery of the demiurge, and thus allow them to return to their original home, the pneumatic world. The founding of the Église catholique Gnostique marked a new era in French Gnosticism, one in which the Martinist tradition became inextricably woven into its fabric. Since Martinism and independent Gnostic churches became for all intents and purposes coterminous after 1907, it may be useful to look at the history and theology of Martinism, which is undertaken later in this chapter. Virtually all the French Gnostic bishops from 1907 until 1968 were also high initiates in Martinist lineages. It is difficult, however, to differentiate between Martinist philosophy and a discrete Gnostic Catholic theology, since the two movements are so tightly interlaced. As shall be shown, the early French Gnostic churches eventually became an exoteric vehicle for those professing Martinism. Part 5. The French State and the Roman Catholic Church, 1890 to 1920. While a cult society thrived, the secular state and the Catholic Church underwent great changes. In 1890, after almost a century of the concordatory constitutional church in France, Pope Leo XIII wished to improve relations with the French state. Rome's new conciliatory attitude towards the French government is known as the ralliement, rallying, and was detailed in the papal encyclical Au milieu de sollicitude, which called for Catholics to work within the Republican government for change. In the 1902 elections, the fate of the Church had become the defining and only significant issue. In the election aftermath, a former doctor and current radical politician named Émile Combes headed the new government. Formerly a candidate for the priesthood, Combes was a virulent anti-cleric as well as a Mason and spiritualist. When he initially took office, he tried to enforce a strict version of the Concordat, which resulted in the dissolution of religious orders and the destruction of the Catholic schools. Under Combes' direction, 200,000 members of 3,216 orders were banned, including the main teaching order in boys' schools, the Frères des Écoles Chrétiennes, and innumerable female orders that provided most of the country's child care, female education, medical care, and welfare. A third of Catholic schools were shut. It was an act of social vandalism by men who did not have to bear the consequences. In response to Combes' draconian measures, Rome cut off diplomatic relations with France in 1904. Forced into a corner, Combes relented and abolished the Concordat. On December 9, 1905, the French government passed legislation and separated church and state, even though this separation cost the church many millions of francs in state support. In the long run, separation was arguably positive because the church was freed from state control and created its own lay organizations. Fin de siècle France saw increased attacks on Catholic hegemony by libre pensée, free thought societies that had begun to be established in 1848. Initially founded to offer a secular alternative to religious funerals, more than 1,000 societies existed around the turn of the century. One way in which citizens chose to thumb their nose at the church was to mandate for themselves a non-religious funeral and a tombstone engraved with secular sentiments. In the estimation of these libre pensée, Christianity was an impediment to scientific progress and moreover was antisocial because of its dogmatic emphasis on personal soteriology. Day-to-day libre pensée activity consisted of minor insults to Catholic susceptibilities, eating sausages at Good Friday banquets, mocking Christian dogma, campaigning to debaptize street names, and ban Catholic processions. Amid this increasingly anti-Roman Catholic atmosphere, Archbishop Joseph-René Villot returned to France in 1907. In Anson's opinion, the anti-clerical government of the 1900s was only too ready to encourage any project to set up a national church in France, independent of the Holy See. Encouraged by the French secular government, Villot established an old Catholic Gallican church, l'Église catholique apostolique francaise, in 1907, and then departed the country later that same year. Julien Ernst Housset took over as primate of l'Église catholique apostolique francaise from Villot in 1907. Housset, known as Abbé Julio, was a former Roman Catholic priest who had been raised to the episcopate in 1904 by Paolo Miraglia Gelotti, who Villot had consecrated in 1900 in Italy. Under Housset, the church focused increasingly on magic and occultism. Fascinated by magic and healing through the power of prayer and the Mass, Housset wrote numerous books along these lines, including Prières Merveilleuses, 1896, Prières Liturgiques, 1900, Prières liturgiques, tome 2, Calendrier perpétuel, Invocation des Saintes Neuvaines Saintes Patrones, 1908, Les Livres Secrets de Grand Exorcisme et Bénédiction, 1902, and Grand Secret Merveilleux, 1906. French monk Louis-Marie François Giraud, 1876 to 1950, left his Cistercian monastery and joined l'Église catholique apostolique francaise, receiving ordination to the priesthood from Vallat on the 21st of June 1907. Housset consecrated Giraud as bishop, who was likewise inclined to the study of magic, on the 21st of June 1911, at a ceremony near Geneva. Giraud settled in the French town of Gazinay near Bordeaux, which became the center of his ministry. The Vallat-Giraud lineage is important to delineate because Douanel's Gnostic Church becomes legitimized through this line, at least as far as the issue of historical apostolic succession is concerned. Jean Bricaud, a former Roman Catholic seminarian who became a major figure in French Gnostic circles, may have been ordained in 1912 by Giraud. Giraud definitely consecrated Bricaud on the 13th of July, 1913. Part 6. Martinez de Pascali and the Elus Cohen. As indicated earlier, the history of Martinism is intimately related to the French Gnostic Church lineages. Serge Calais, a French Martinist and scholar of the tradition, defines the word to denote the doctrine and theurgical practices of Martinez de Pascali, 1709 to 1774, as well as the theosophy of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, 1743 to 1803. It also may refer to Jean-Baptiste Willermoz' rectified Scottish Rite, a Masonic system that he established after the death of his teacher, Pascali. Additionally, the term is used to refer to the distinct Martinist order that Dr. Gerard and Cosse founded in the late 1800s and its filial descendants, as well as to those who follow St. Martin's teachings, whether or not they belong to an established Martinist order. Martinez de Pascali's Masonic organization became one of the most prominent esoteric societies to emerge at this time. His students, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin and Jean-Baptiste Willermoz, 1730 to 1824, continued to advance his legacy in their separate and distinctive ways. In the modern era, two primary currents of the tradition exist. According to Calais, the Papucian lineage and the Ambalan lineage of the Neo-Cohanes, both which will be discussed later in this chapter. Modern Martinists look to Martinez de Pascali as the seminal inspiration of their essential doctrine. Very little documentation exists about Pascali's earlier life, other than the fact that he spent a decade in the Spanish military as a young man. The son of a Freemason, Pascali was also an enthusiastic Mason, and in 1754 founded a Masonic lodge in Montpellier. In 1762, he established a lodge in Bordeaux called the Temple des Élus Cohen, Temple of the Elect Cohens, which a young Saint Martin joined. Eventually, he set up his own version of Masonry, the Ordre des Chevaliers Maçons Élus Cohens de l'Univers. It was into this order that Pascali initiated Jean-Baptiste Willermoz, a critical figure in Masonic history. Pascali spent the years from 1767 to 1772 systematizing his teachings and writing rituals that he described to his students. In 1771, St. Martin began helping him with this task. Kabbalistic elements, including number mysticism, gematria, figure prominently in Pascali's complex cosmology. He outlined his tenets in his only book, Traite sur la réintégration des dans leur première propriété verrou et puissance spirituelle divine, treatise on the reintegration of beings into their own virtues, powers, and qualities. a volume considered a modern theosophical tour de force. The mythos underlying Pascali's concepts is based on a Kabbalistic interpretation of portions of the Bible, primarily Genesis. Briefly outlined, humans are essentially divine in nature and potentiality, and are ranked above the angelic order in the original scheme of creation. God charged them to administer a peaceful, orderly universe and restrict the wicked. The angelic order, on the other hand, was created to praise him and to relish a divine life. They did not have the elevated administrative responsibilities conferred upon humankind. Then the plan went awry. The disobedient angels, or perverse beings, as Pascali calls them, rebelled, resolving to exist in opposition to God. Subsequently, these insubordinate angels seduced humans into their nefarious design. Robert Amberlin, a Martinist and a French Gnostic bishop, describes the scenario. Under the impulse of the perverse beings, archetypal man made himself an independent demiurge, thereby breaking the very laws he was ordained to observe. He dared to make himself a creator, creating the material world, in turn, and to be equal to God by his deeds. He delineates the agenda of the evil angels. They have taken shelter in the material world in order to separate themselves further from God. Their plan is to keep humans captive in order that humans might organize and animate the earth, rather like indentured servants, as he expresses it. To escape the cycles of reincarnation in this infernal world, man must detach himself from everything that attracts him to matter. The fallen entities, however, constantly fight man's tendencies towards perfection by tempting him constantly so as to make him stay in a world where they can maintain their rulership over him. In order to break free from the material illusion and their enslavement to the perverse beings that hold them in a hypnotic sway, humans must employ their will, which is the only divine faculty they have retained in their dissipated state. God sent the repairer, Jesus Christ, to illuminate the path to restoration of humankind's true place in the cosmos. If humans realize that they possess amazing celestial potentialities and powers, they will be in a position to release themselves from their exile in the material world. Regaining the Adamic legacy that was abandoned in the fall, they can resume their rightful cosmological standing. Once this is achieved, humans become dedicated to the reintegration of all beings, including the natural world, helping them return to their divinely ordained roles and conditions. Pascali held that the practice of a complex system of ceremonial magic was an important element in spiritual advancement. He considered one of the consequences of the fall to have been a cessation of communication between humans and the divine. Theurgic operations were needed, therefore, in order to contact intermediaries who would connect the ritualist with Christ. On the surface, there seems to be a discrepancy in the fact that the Roman Catholic Church prohibited its congregants from Masonic involvement, and the vast majority of Elus Kohen, including Pascali himself and later St. Martin, were practicing Roman Catholics. Mackintosh clarifies the curious situation. Although Clement XII had issued a papal bull opposing Freemasonry in 1738, it was for the most part disregarded in France. Roman Catholic laity and even priests were active in the French Freemasonry movement. Freemasonry enjoyed a huge degree of popularity in predominantly Roman Catholic France during the latter 18th century. In 1772, at the height of the Elus Kohen's popularity, Pascali sailed to San Domingo to oversee some family matters. He never returned to France, dying in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, on the 20th of September 1774. By 1778, most of the Elus Kohen temples were shuttered, although at least two carried on until the Revolution. According to Serge Calais, Robert Amberlain, Sar Arifer, 1907 to 1997, reawakened the Alus Kohen in 1942 to 1943 during the Nazi occupation of France, even in the face of German persecution of Masonic societies. Amber Lane's newly constituted Martinist Order of the Alus Kohen was dedicated to the theurgic rites of Pascali. Calais believes that although there was no direct ritual initiatic succession between Pascali and Amberlane, there was a valid spiritual filiation. After operating for several years, Amberlane put the lodge to rest, only to revive it 30 years later. Orders still exist that call themselves Alus Kohen and claim to be spiritual heirs to Pascali's ceremonial magic system. Part 7. Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin and Jean-Baptiste Willermoz. In the years immediately preceding the French Revolution, France's fragile economic, social, and political state of affairs fostered the exponential growth of that country's esoteric, spiritualistic, and occult groups. It was at this time that the man Antoine Favre lauds as the most important Christian esotericist of his time, whose influence, directly or indirectly, has never ceased to spread. Favre is referring to Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, Pascali's foremost disciple. Saint-Martin was born in France in 1743, and as a young man he joined the military. While he was stationed at Bordeaux, he encountered Pascali, who initiated him into the Alus Kohen in 1768. From 1768 to 1771, Pascali employed Saint Martin as his personal secretary, and in 1771 Saint Martin left the military to give over his life to spiritual study. Even previous to the death of Pascali in 1774, however, Saint Martin slowly began to move away from his master's emphasis on theurgy. Saint Martin believed, in line with Pascali's philosophy, that human beings were of supreme importance in the divine plan. They possessed godlike abilities and were Christs in potentio, but most frittered away their lives as sleepwalkers, unaware of the latent powers within. To become reborn is a difficult path, St. Martin acknowledged, and he saw self-discipline and to some degree asceticism as essential aspects of the inner way. He advocated that humankind recover its primeval nature and supremacy through the regenerative influence of Christ, through spiritual contemplation and prayer, through the exercise of will and devotion to God. Success in this endeavor results in a second birth, a creation of the new man. In 1775, Saint Martin published his first book, De Erreur et de la Vérité par une philosophie inconnue, of errors and the truth by an unknown philosopher, which the Spanish Inquisition condemned in 1798. Always writing under the moniker The Unknown Philosopher, he followed this tome with several more books in which he sought to combat modern rationalist and materialist reductionism. By 1803, when Saint Martin died of a stroke, his works had circulated throughout France and in many other European countries as well, garnering him a notable reputation as a philosopher. A member of the original Alus Kohen tribunal and a close friend of Saint Martin, Jean-Baptiste Willermoz, directed the vibrant Alus Kohen temple in Lyon. After Pascali's death, Willermoz became a central figure in the reformation of French Templar Masonry. In 1778, satisfied that he had discovered the esoteric secrets of Masonry, he founded a Masonic order that taught inner Christian teachings in the higher degrees. Willermoz called his society the Rectified Scottish Rite, which included the degree of l'Ordre des Chevaliers Bienfaisants de la Cité Sainte, Order of the Knights Beneficent of the Holy City. Willermoz presupposed a link to the medieval Order of the Knights Templar, considered by him to be one of the repositories of ancient and divinely inspired wisdom, transmitted through lodge initiates to the present day. Part 8. Modern Martinism. The era of modern Martinism commenced during the period of the occult revival in France. Dr. Girardin Cosse, 1865 to 1916, whose magical and pen name was Papus, was initiated into Martinism in 1882 and founded a Martinist order in 1891. While he was baptized and confirmed a Roman Catholic, Papus would eventually be considered a serious adversary of the Church. He was a member of the Paris Temple of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as well as the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Croix under the Grand Master Marquis Stanislas de Gautier. L'Ordre Martiniste, the Martinist order, whose official name was L'Ordre des Supérieurs Inconnus, Order of the Unknown Superiors, initially consisted of a 12-member Supreme Council with Papus as Grand Master and President. Other original members of the tribunal included occultist Josephine Pelladin, 1858 to 1918, and Stanislas de Gautier, 1861 to 1897. Co-founders of the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Croix. As the order grew, it attracted numerous occultists and visionaries, including René Guénon, 1886 to 1951, who was affiliated with the Martinist order between 1906 and 1912. Papus wished to create a society that would bring together Martinist initiates and provide an opportunity for further study and promulgation of the Martinist teachings. His Martinist order flourished in the next quarter of a century, spreading as far as Russia and the court of Nicholas II. The Martinist order under Papus was officially allied with an independent sacramental church, the l'Église Gnostique Universelle, the Universal Gnostic Church, UGC, whose origins were in Jules Douinel's aforementioned l'Église Gnostique de Francaise. In February 1908, the newly established Episcopal Synod elected Jean Bricaud, 1882 to 1934, who took the name Tao Jean II as the new church's patriarch. The church headed by Bricaud changed its name to l'Église Gnostique Universelle, EGU. To avoid confusion with Bricaud's group, Fabre des Essarts Church became identified as l'Église Gnostique de Francaise. Between 1910 and 1916, Bricaud and Papus corresponded about the issue of an esoteric church. Papus was searching for an esoteric structure with which to link the Martinist order, and to this end he sought affiliations with small churches such as the EGU. Even after the 1911 treaty officially designating the EGU as the official Martinist church, confusion and arguments about the designation still flew. Bricaud explained to Papus that the exoteric Roman Catholic Church had the Pope as its head. For the esoteric church, there was the Gnostic Patriarch. Bricaud and Papus evidently came to an understanding, because the Martinist order reaffirmed this affiliation in 1918. In 1913, Louis-Marie François Giraud consecrated Bricaud, thus legitimizing the EGU in terms of traditional apostolic succession, which came through Giraud from the Valois lineage. In 1916, Papus died while serving as a French army surgeon and caring for soldiers at the front. After his demise, his renewed Martinist movement lost its unity and began to fragment with the loss of its unfaltering guide. The structure of the Martinist world became increasingly complicated as orders splintered and formed new alliances and orders. Martinism is still a vital part of the esoteric subculture, although the actual number of adherents does not seem to be large. Calais reflects, by definition, initiatic schools are reserved for a small number of people. Therefore, we must not be surprised to see that this number is relatively low, even though the research being done by various Martinist groups has intensified at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. Initiatic paths are closed paths and narrow paths. Although from the time of Papus, at least until 1968, many Martinist luminaries, including Jules Douinel, René Guénon, Papus, Jean Bricaud, Victor Blanchard, Constant Chevillon, Robert Ambelin and Philippe Cos, Pappus's son, 1906 to 1984, held clerical offices in independent sacramental Gnostic churches. Most of the larger Martinist orders are no longer officially aligned with specific churches or ecclesiastical bodies. There seems to be little direct influence of the Martinist movement on contemporary independent esoteric sacramental churches, although individual IESC members often belong to one or more occult or esoteric orders. In that sense, there is some continued overlap and cross-fertilization between Martinism and the independent sacramental movement. Chapter 3. Arnold Harris Matthew and the Early History of the Liberal Catholic Church. Part 1. Arnold Harris Matthew. Arnold Harris Matthew, 1852 to 1919, the first British Old Catholic bishop, underwent a strange ecclesiastical journey, rivaling the convoluted life of Joseph René Vallot, although Matthew limited his adventuring to the geographical confines of Western Europe. Before we examine his singular biography, it would be helpful to briefly explore the religious milieu of mid- and late Victorian England, the initial setting of this chapter's history. Especially illuminating is an understanding of the Anglo-Catholic revival and the debate around the validity of Anglican holy orders. In the foreword to Brandreth's classic Episcopi Vagantes and the Anglican Church, Reverend Canon J. A. Douglas tries to comprehend the enormous increase of Episcopi Vagantes in England and America from about 1850 to 1950. According to Douglas, the phenomenon of irregular bishops was almost unheard of in the Middle Ages, and he knows of none in the 17th and 18th centuries. He notes that until the Tractarian movement and the Anglo-Catholic revival in the mid-1800s, most probably the only people concerned with the validity of Anglican orders were theologians. By the 1890s, though, valid apostolic orders became a general topic of concern in the Anglican Church. Writing in 1947, Douglas maintains that the Anglo-Catholic revival and the subsequent questions about the validity of orders provided the impetus for this proliferation of Episcopi Vagantes. The Tractarian movement, also called the Oxford movement, and the various streams of Anglo-Catholicism of the High Victorian period rocked the Church of England, at the time an immense and heterogeneous institution that David Morse notes wryly was a massive force for inertia. The High Church Victorian revival was related in certain ways to the 17th century High Church theologians, including Richard Hooker, 1554 to 1645, Richard Bancroft, 1544 to 1610, and the Caroline Divines. Generally speaking, the High Church tradition emphasizes the primacy of the apostolic succession, the Catholicism of the Church, and a high doctrine of the Church in which the state is aware of its divinely ordained function as the protector of the Church. While the Tractarian movement of 1833 to 1848 is often conflated with High Church theology and Anglo-Catholicism, there exist subtle but important differences between these groups. Even within Anglo-Catholicism, which has as its raison d'etre to Catholicize the Anglican Church, there exists great diversity. Pickering contends that while the Tractarians and Anglo-Catholics have similar objectives, namely to restore and revivify the Catholic nature of the Anglican Church, the Anglo-Catholics advocated a much more rapid pace of change within 19th century church life. The Tractarians, on the other hand, advocated a more measured and gradual Catholic restoration, firmly grounded in the traditional Anglican Book of Common Prayer. At the height of the Anglo-Catholic movement in the 1920s and 1930s, some Anglo-Catholic clergy traveled to Italy and France and returned with quantities of Roman Catholic vestments and accoutrements such as confessionals, ciboria, and monstrances. Along with such paraphernalia, these clergy instituted devotions such as the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, the chanting of the Rosary, and prayers to the saints and the Holy Mother. Devotion to the saints, including the Blessed Virgin, was not a part of the Tractarian platform, as they considered it against Anglican tradition in light of the 1662 prayer book. There were, however, points of accord between the two movements, including an emphasis on the inherently Catholic nature of the Anglican Church, stress on the Incarnation rather than the Protestant emphasis on atonement, the centrality of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, the reinstitution of nuns and monks, and auricular confession. The popularity of Anglo-Catholicism, which was due in part to its simple and straightforward formula of religiosity for the laity, is demonstrated by the rise in membership of the Anglo-Catholic Society, the English Church Union. Founded in 1860, it began with 200 members. By 1894, membership had grown to 35,000, and by 1901 to 39,000. The Tractarian movement was an assemblage of Oxford Fellows who were highly dissatisfied with the increasing liberalism of the Anglican Church. Arch-conservatives in a political and social sense, they argued against a laxity of doctrine, Erastianism, subverting the Church's traditional power to the state, and disestablishment. For the Tractarians, the Church was divinely constituted and of divine status. Issues of authority were at the heart of the debates that rankled the 19th century Church of England, including the authority of the Church as an autonomous body over and against the state, the limits of the state's authority within a church still recognized as the Church of the nation, the nature of the authority to be ascribed to the sources of the Church's teaching, the scriptures, the fathers of the Church, and the prayer book. Since the 18th century, the Church had been accused of clerical abuses of power, including simony and the holding of multiple livings. Politicians and Anglican clergy of the 1820s and 1830s campaigned vociferously for reforms within the Church, and those 2 decades saw legislative activity aimed at lessening Church corruption and increasing suffrage. Most notably, the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts in 1828 and passing of the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829 increased general civil rights for dissenters and Roman Catholics, while the Reform Act of 1832 initiated much-needed electoral reform. In 1832, the Whig government formed the Ecclesiastical Committee in order to examine the activities of the Church and to suggest improvements. The Tractarians saw these political acts as intolerable interferences by the state into the divinely sanctioned institution of the Church. As Owen Chadwick writes, it is safe to say that the Tractarian movement would not have taken the form which it took without the impetus of ecclesiastical and secular politics. The final straw for the Tractarians was the Whig government's Irish Church Temporalities Bill, which aimed to reduce the number of bishoprics in Ireland and funnel the money elsewhere. The bill occasioned Reverend John Keble's fervent assize sermon of 1833, entitled National Apostasy, which condemns state interference with the Church of England, and is seen as the beginning of the Oxford movement. After that rousing oration, the founding members of the Oxford movement, John Henry Newman, John Keble, and Edward Pusey, began publishing tracts outlining their views. At that time, Oxford University was an Anglican institution, and its fellows were priests who stayed unmarried as long as they held their fellowships. Since specialized schools of divinity were unheard of in England during that period, British clergy, as well as future leaders of the Church and state, were educated primarily at Oxford and Cambridge. In addition to the divine status of the Church, the Tractarian central concerns revolved around the real presence in the Eucharist and the subject of apostolic succession. For definitive positions on these matters, the Oxford movement looked back to the Church Fathers as the arbiters of the original and undefiled form of Christianity. The considerable accumulation of patristic scholarship from the 16th century onward, as a consequence of the new learning, had a salutary effect on the efforts of Tractarians. The inauguration of the new learning was due to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the subsequent exiling of Byzantine scholars to Italy, which had reintroduced Europe to the classical Greek philosophers. The resultant gains in research revealed early Christianity in a vastly different light than had previously been supposed. As better editions of the patristic works were printed and critical research and linguistic methods employed, it was clear that the patristic writers favored the traditionalists rather than the reformers. This new knowledge unveiled the Church Fathers, for the most part, as endorsing the centrality of the bishop to church polity, a high regard for the celibate life, auricular confession, and even devotions to the saints and the Blessed Virgin, as well as a deep sense of the sacredness of the world. In short, the advance of patristic scholarship befriended the conservative and traditional element everywhere in Protestantism, and nowhere more significantly than in the Church of England. In 1839, Newman started an in-depth study of the Donatist and Monophysite heresies of the early Church. His intense research only deepened his questions in regard to the Anglican position on the primacy of the Pope, the nature of apostolic succession, and the necessity of church union. After much contemplation, Newman submitted to Rome in October 1845, an act that engendered feelings of shock and betrayal among his fellow Tractarians. His reception into the Roman Catholic Church gave rise to the charge that the foregone conclusion of the Oxford movement was ultimately conversion. While his decision drew great criticism and anger from many Anglo-Catholics, others followed his example, leading one scholar to exclaim, "The carnage in the Church of England was frightful. Although many of those Anglo-Catholics who remained in the English Church prayed for a reunion with Rome, those hopes were dashed when the Vatican officially denied the validity of Anglican orders in 1896. Arnold Harris Matthew, the British Old Catholic bishop who eventually became caught up in the validity debate, was born in France in 1852, just 7 years after Newman's conversion. The child of a French mother and an English father, his first baptism was at the hands of a French Catholic abbé. He later underwent baptism by an Anglican priest. As he grew up, he attended rites in both the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. For most of his life he vacillated between Canterbury and Rome, an ambiguity undoubtedly precipitated by his baptism and upbringing in two different church bodies. Matthew commenced his lifelong clerical vocation at the age of 25, when he was ordained a Roman Catholic priest in Glasgow. Between 1879 and 1889, he served in several dioceses, never staying long in one area. In May 1889, he resigned his priestly orders after suffering a crisis of faith. That same year, Rome placed him under the lesser excommunication. Between 1889 and 1890, there was general surprise when Matthew became a member of the Unitarian Church, a dramatic volte-face from Catholicism. The denomination's primary newspaper, The Inquirer, published a laudatory article in its 12th of July 1889 issue, celebrating Matthew's enrollment. The Unitarian fold did not contain him for long, hardly more than 1 year, before he turned to the Anglican Church for spiritual sustenance and employment. The Bishop of London, Dr. Temple, allowed Matthew to officiate at weddings at the Anglo-Catholic Holy Trinity Church, Sloane Street, which was irregular considering that he was not an Anglican. In addition, Church of England authorities invited him to work in one of their congregations on an unofficial basis under Canon Robert Eaton. The experiment was a failure. Matthew found the canon odious and lewd. Reverend Eaton eventually left England amid charges of serious, albeit unspecified, immorality. Realizing that he was not suited to serve within the establishment, as he put it, Matthew relinquished his post under Eaton in 1892 and retired from the ministry until 1907. He never officially rejoined or took orders in the Church of England, although he was married in an Anglican church in 1892. One barrier to his formal enrollment was his adamant refusal to sign the form of renunciation of Roman errors. He did, however, engage in correspondence with the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1907, inquiring about a ministerial position in the church, although this proposal never fructified. In 1907, Reverend Richard O'Halloran contacted Matthew and encouraged him to enter the clerical arena once more. O'Halloran, a suspended Roman Catholic priest in charge of a fledgling mission in the West London community of Ealing, wished to establish an Old Catholic church in England. He had already unsuccessfully approached an Old Catholic bishop for consecration in 1902. 5 years later, still hoping and enthusiastic to bring the Old Catholic Church to Britain, O'Halloran prevailed upon Matthew to consider consecration in the Old Catholic Church. The priest informed him that there was a great need for such a church, and that a synod in Chelsfield, Hertfordshire, had elected Matthew to the bishopric. Hearing this, Matthew agreed to the arrangement. Archbishop Gerald Goule, assisted by 3 other Old Catholic bishops, consecrated Matthew at St. Gertrude's Cathedral in Utrecht on the 28th of April 1908. The ceremony, originally scheduled for April 8th, had to be postponed when the Old Catholic bishops, to their great astonishment, found out that Matthew was married and the father of 3 children. Although no married priest had yet been raised to the episcopate in the Old Catholic Church, the bishops eventually gave their permission for Matthew's consecration to proceed. Ultimately, it was revealed that there existed little interest among the English for such a church, but purportedly Matthew did not find that out until after his consecration. As James Wedgwood put it, the number of active adherents in that country could be counted on one hand. In a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury in May 1909, Matthew referred to this situation, writing, "I neither desired nor sought episcopal consecration. I was completely deceived and entirely misled by blank, a man who has deceived many besides myself." Matthew claimed that once he realized that there was in fact no Old Catholic congregation in England, he offered to resign, saying that a particular priest, O'Halloran, had made certain statistical representations about parishioners to the Old Catholic bishops that were untrue. The Old Catholic bishops declined his offer of resignation and instead affirmed their confidence in Matthew. Now active as a bishop in Britain, Matthew first ordained Reverend Noel Lambert, a Congregationalist minister, in 1909, and followed this with other ordinations and the establishment of a cathedral. Like his other ecclesial affiliations, Matthew's connection with the Old Catholics proved to be short-lived. He was in full communion with the Old Catholics until the 29th of December 1910. When he made his separation formal in a document entitled Declaration of Autonomy and Independence. The Old Catholic Conference of Bishops officially withdrew their recognition of Bishop Matthew in 1913. Nonetheless, his episcopal activities did not slow down at all after cutting ties with the Old Catholics. In 1911, he consecrated 4 of his 8 priests as bishops. The new bishops in turn elected him Archbishop of London. Once the Vatican was informed of these goings-on, Matthew was placed under the Greater Excommunication. In the Declaration of Excommunication dated 11th of February 1911, Pope Pius X charged that Matthew was a pseudo-bishop who has not hesitated to arrogate unto himself the title of Anglo-Catholic Archbishop of London. 2 years later, Matthew unsuccessfully sued the Times of London for libel after the paper published an excerpt of the papal document excommunicating him. During this period, Matthew consecrated 2 bishops that proved especially important to the future of the independent sacramental movement, Prince de Landis-Berges and Frederick Samuel Willoughby. Prince de Landis-Berges, 1873 to 1920, a Roman Catholic and a member of the Austrian royal family born in Italy, became friends with Matthew, who ordained the prince in 1912 and consecrated him in 1913. Due to the outbreak of the Great War in August 1914, de Landis-Berges was in jeopardy of being interred as an enemy alien. The British Foreign Office, aware that he was related to numerous European royal families, arranged passage for him to the United States in 1914. Once in America, Bishop de Landesberges consecrated several bishops who became important leaders in the Old Catholic movement in America, including Carmel Henry Carfora in 1916 and Stanislaus Mickiewicz in 1917. Before his death, Bishop de Landesberges returned to the Roman Catholic fold. He died in an Augustinian community in Pennsylvania in 1920. Although Frederick Samuel Willoughby, 1862 to 1928, confined his brief Old Catholic ministry to the United Kingdom, his lineal descendants established the Liberal Catholic Church, which became the most numerically successful of all the Matthew successions. The beginning of the LCC goes back to 1913, when the young James Ingle Wedgwood, 1892 to 1951, a scion of the famous China manufacturing dynasty and an ardent theosophist, became a member of Matthew's small congregation and was ordained soon after his entrance. Willoughby, formerly an Anglo-Catholic priest, joined Matthews in 1914 and in short order was ordained as well. When de Landesberges departed the country, Matthew was left without a coadjutor bishop with whom to run the diocese. Not long after the prince's exodus, therefore, Matthew informed his congregation that an election had been held, resulting in Willoughby being elected to the bishopric over Wedgwood. Willoughby's consecration was held in October 1914, witnessed by two canons, both of whom belonged to the Theosophical Society and the Order of the Star in the East, the society founded in 1911 to prepare for the advent of a world teacher in the person of Jiddu Krishnamurti. By this time, more theosophists had joined the congregation. What drew these esotericists into the conservative bastion of Matthew's church? While there is not enough information to say for sure, one may surmise that the traditional Catholic ritual, including the liturgy, vestments, and other paraphernalia, may have been highly attractive to Wedgwood and Willoughby, both former Anglo-Catholics. Along with other theosophists, Old Catholicism also offered a method of being Catholic but not Roman, with the added inducement of a claim to apostolic succession. Since Leo XIII formally condemned Anglican orders in his bull Apostolicae Curiae in 1896, those theosophists wishing to become priests in the apostolic line may have felt more secure with orders originating from the independent Dutch Catholic lineage. As part of joining Matthew's ancient Catholic Church of Great Britain, Wedgwood signed a statement averring that he was formally united with the ancient Catholic Church of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and professed his belief in the decrees of the seven holy ecumenical councils as laid down in precise terms in the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed of the Universal Church, the dogma of transubstantiation, the seven sacraments, and the decrees of the Synod of Jerusalem 1672. In light of Madame Blavatsky's negative views of traditional Christianity, and specifically the apostolic succession, though it seems a curious move for her followers to adhere themselves to an Orthodox church. The democratization of spirituality, as advocated initially by Theosophy, campaigned against the idea of a priesthood to mediate between the individual soul and the Atman. The tension caused by Christian-oriented factions within the Theosophical Society will be probed later in this chapter. One must ask why Matthew accepted the Theosophists into his fold, since at this time the prelate held a highly orthodox stance on doctrine. Given Matthew's highly erratic nature, though, it was not out of character for Matthew to act in ways that defy logical explanation. For whatever reason, Matthew denounced the Theosophical Society in a letter to his congregants dated the 6th of August 1915, declaring that no one could be both a member of his church and a Theosophist, or a member of the Order of the Star in the East. In response to this ultimatum, Willoughby, Wedgwood, and most of Matthew's parishioners left to form a separate Old Catholic Church. A more detailed account of the origins and early history of the LCC will be related later in this chapter. Also, in 1915, Matthew penned a missive to the Archbishop of Canterbury with his idea of founding an offshoot of the Old Catholic Church in Britain. The Archbishop of Canterbury's secretary wrote back that it seemed to be Matthew's goal to invite the Bishop of London to be reconsecrated by Matthew. In addition, the secretary continued, Matthew appeared to be asking that the Church of England recognize him and his congregation as representatives of the Holy Catholic Church in this country. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself wrote, believing as I do that the Church of England is in this country the true representative of the Catholic Church, as it comes down to us from the past, I can hardly be expected to look favorably upon the establishment in England of another society claiming that position. In another communique, Matthew tried to clear up any misunderstanding, but most likely only offended the Archbishop in even greater measure. We are not so absurd as to claim to be exclusively the Holy Catholic Church in this country, but rather a very humble little Catholic mission, possessing indisputable orders and valid sacraments. Matthew took this opportunity to point out that the Roman Church did not recognize the Church of England's orders as valid. Pope Leo XIII had declared them absolutely null and utterly void. If the Bishop of London were reconsecrated, then his orders would be negotiable all around the world. In Matthew's opinion, needless to say, the Anglicans ignored his humbling entreaties. The Archbishop of Canterbury went so far as to have a statement outlining Matthew's history published in The Guardian on the 19th of August 1915. Matthew complained to the Archbishop that his private letters to the prelate were treated carelessly, and in this way the Archbishop helped his persecutors. After this series of debacles, Matthew, left with very few congregants and no priests, publicly resigned his bishopric in January 1916 and planned to re-enter the Roman Catholic Church. The terms of submission to Rome proved not to his liking, however, and later that year he restarted his old Catholic mission under the rubric of the Western Uniate Catholic Church. This jurisdiction is the origin of another independent Catholic lineage, resulting from Matthew's consecration of Bernard Mary Williams to the episcopate on the 14th of April 1914. In 1917, Matthew chose Williams as his coadjutor and successor, and Williams remained one of his few loyal supporters until the end of Matthew's life. Matthew once again approached the long-suffering Archbishop of Canterbury for a clerical position, but was refused, although the Archbishop did consent to allow him to join the church as a member of the laity. Matthew declined the offer. He lived his remaining few years in poverty with few friends, supporters, or family members, his wife having divorced him long before. Matthew died in December 1919 and was buried with Anglican rites. Part 2. The British Occult Revival and the Origins of the Liberal Catholic Church. Understanding mid- and late Victorian religious sensibilities, as well as the Edwardian cultural and intellectual milieu, lends a useful context in which to locate the Liberal Catholic Church, LCC, founded in England in 1916. In the mid-Victorian age, the social and cultural fabric of England was being undone and rewoven in new ways, as increased urbanization and mechanization changed the nature of domicile and work for many. Amazing inventions such as the modern steam locomotive, 1830, the telegraph, 1844, and the telephone, 1876, meant people could travel and communicate faster and farther than ever before. The magical qualities of such fabrications indicated to some Victorians that the world was imbued with mysterious, intangible, and often unsettling energies. This increasingly automated, fast-paced society may have been at the root of much of Victorian anxiety and sense of alienation. Historians theorize that in the mid-1850s and onward, developments in science and the progressively more impersonal social order sparked the oft-mentioned Victorian crisis of faith. Eileen Fife and John Van Wy clarify this state of affairs. Although much has been made of a mid-Victorian crisis of faith, perhaps triggered by the sciences, This seems to have been a feature of a certain class of intellectuals and not an accurate description of the majority of society, especially middle-class society, which retained a religious faith long after most expert men of science. It is furthermore impossible to accurately assess the assumed loss of faith on the part of the Victorian populace. All social scientists may do is to try to gauge the demonstrable actions. While researchers may attempt to track church membership and attendance, the process of ceasing to believe can never be fully chronicled. In addition to the problems of quantifying belief, another important issue arises when considering the so-called Victorian faith crisis. John Hedley Brooks suggests that the idea that science and religion, which are terms that defy simple definition, are not implacable enemies, but have been so cast in simple analyses of secularization. Such an oppositional treatment ignores the problematic of defining the terms science and religion, and disregards the ways in which both have overlapped. Indeed, the relationship between religion and science does not exist. What may be examined in what different individuals have made of it, the relationship in a plethora of contexts, since many tomes have been dedicated to analyses of the ever-shifting connections between science and religion. This chapter can only suggest the difficulties of an uncomplicated assessment of late Victorian secularization. Whatever its role in the changing faith climate, successful demonstrations of science's power astonished people with its ability to correctly foresee such events. One notable occasion was the appearance of a comet in 1758, which took place just as Edward Halley predicted. Simultaneously, the new scholarly methodology of historical criticism began to destabilize the authority of the Christian scriptures, a problem especially for Protestants with their stance of sola scriptura. Perhaps in an attempt to counterbalance these cultural and intellectual shifts, some Victorians embarked on a search for significance and meaning beyond what their mainline churches could offer. One of the ways in which this quest took shape was interest in the supernatural. Spiritualist activities such as seances and church services designed to contact the dead experienced an enormous wave of popularity in England between 1850 and 1870. A notable interest in mesmerism in the 1830s and 1840s preceded this trend. Historians point to Swedenborg's writings, first published in England in 1845, and mesmerism as matrices of the spiritualist movement in Britain. While the reasons for this upsurge in popularity are varied and complex, clearly by the 1890s, spiritualism generated a great allure for many of the educated class. Highly regarded Victorian professionals, including professors and scientists, among them fellows of the Royal Society, lent their backing to psychical research, which they envisioned as an exciting new area of science. In the hands of impartial truth-seekers, the scientific method would open a path into the occult and reduce its seemingly erratic and haphazard character. Accordingly, many people practiced and investigated the occult in a scientific manner. Mesmerists conducted experiments, and spiritualists kept careful record of what unfolded in their seances. Spiritualists and occultists objected not to the scientific method per se, but rather to scientism, which puts forth a mechanistic worldview and holds that only through science may one adjudicate the truth. Leading Victorian spiritualists sought to establish the incorporeal realm as the animator of matter, using similar empirical methods to those employed by the materialistic scientists. There were those in the spiritualist camp, though, who did not believe that the spirit could be measured in the same way as physical objects, and remonstrated against the use of the scientific method to quantify spirit. While Victorian spiritualism appealed to a wide swath of the population, aficionados of occultism at the fin de siècle gathered together in select, elite, and sometimes secret societies. These more intimate groups did not focus on communicating with the dead. Rather, they were drawn together by the promise of initiation, secret teachings, magical ceremonies, and ultimately self-illumination and adepthood. The Theosophical Society, TS, founded in New York in 1875, became the most popular of these groups. It is hard to conceive, though, of Theosophy experiencing the success it did without spiritualism to pave the way in many respects. One wonders if the founders of the Theosophical Society, the Russian Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and the American Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, 1832 to 1907, would have ever crossed paths without their common interest in spiritualism. Scholars have traditionally argued that the Victorian occult revival was based on a retreat into an irrational and imaginary realm, created as a bulwark for those yearning for firmer existential ground in the face of immense cultural shifts. More recent theories of occultism, tendered by scholars such as Francis Yates and Antoine Favre, debunk this viewpoint, positing magic as a sound ontology in its own right. Alison Butler also contends that the magical worldview undergirding occultism is coherent and rational, and not merely an escapist strategy in the face of encroaching scientism. In Butler's assessment, the Fraserian conception of magic as inferior, held without questions by academics in general until recently, is erroneous. To briefly summarize, Sir James Fraser, 1854 to 1941, argued that civilization underwent a triadic progression of magic, religion, and science. Early humans employed sympathetic magic as a means of ordering their world and control the capricious forces of nature. Eventually, human society progressed to institutionalized religion in an attempt to achieve the same goals. Science, which stood at the zenith of this threefold sequence, would eventually reign supreme, as the earlier two archaic categories of magic and religion fell away. As scholarship in the anthropology of religion and related fields has improved over the years, Fraser's theories have lost support in the academy. Clearly, modernity is not synonymous with positivism and secularism, and vice versa, the occult sciences are not inherently at odds with rationality. Favre sees occultism primarily as the product of the interaction of traditional occult philosophy and scientism in the 19th century. As a heterogeneous countercurrent that developed in reaction to materialistic positivism, occultism sought to amalgamate the Philosophia Occulta with scientific advances. Clearly, occult practitioners of this period saw their magical and spiritual work as a kind of science using definable but oft-hidden cosmic laws, as revealed in the signatures of nature, the system of correspondences that weaves the world into an organic wholeness. This occultism, in its followers' estimation, operated not from a locus of faith, but from a scientific foundation. With the Theosophists, for example, understanding science and religion as facets of a unitary philosophy. Critics, on the other hand, saw this as an inappropriate and baseless attempt at the co-option of modern science by the spiritualists. Historians have noted the ways in which the strain of mass societal changes also fed the Victorian tendency to hyperbolize the mysteries of Oriental cultures, among them India and Tibet. A certain Victorian attraction for obscure sects, Gothic and medieval motifs, and ancient civilizations also lent themselves to Theosophy's popularity. Moreover, the Theosophical Society thus emerged at a time when discussion of the world's major religions and exposure to Eastern sacred texts were part of educated Victorian cultural life. By and large, the Theosophical Society consisted of the privileged and well-informed that conversed with ease about novel and burgeoning fields like anthropology, comparative religion, psychology, and sociology. In addition to occult societies, other significant factions of the time included social justice movements promulgating vegetarianism, anti-vivisection, and feminism. Occult groups drew many of these social activists, appearing more amenable to such concerns than did mainline clergy, although many parishioners of more traditional churches supported women's suffrage. The Theosophical Society and other like-minded groups often offered more receptivity to feminism and emancipation than did the socialist organizations of the time. As early as June 1911, Theosophy displayed its explicit connections with feminism when Besant and other Theosophical Society members marched in the women's coronation procession for suffrage held in London, dressed in full Masonic regalia, and under the banner of Universal Co-Masonry. Not surprisingly, recent studies saw that a high proportion of prominent Edwardian feminists joined the Theosophical Society. In late 19th century Britain, the vast majority of women were not admitted to most professional occupations or to the leading universities. Theosophy offered a venue in which women held high offices and wielded power in ways almost unheard of in other British institutions, thus holding great appeal for the new woman of the 1890s. In addition to the enthrallment with arcana, the 1880s and 1890s saw a renewed curiosity in both Roman Catholic and Protestant circles about the mystical Christianity of earlier times, specifically in the medieval period and the Renaissance. Thus, the liberal Catholic Church became one of several groups offering alternatives to traditional Christian theology and practice. The publication of a number of influential works marked this period, including Anna Kingsford and Edward Maitland's The Perfect Way, 1882, William Ing's Christian Mysticism in 1899, and Besant's Esoteric Christianity in 1901. In 1911, Evelyn Underhill, formerly affiliated with Arthur Edward Waite's magical order, published her ever-popular book, Mysticism. Underhill had abandoned her work as a ceremonial magician, turning instead to a mystical approach of her native faith that was very much along the lines of Kingsford's work. Currents of Christian mysticism did exist in the Theosophical Society, although Blavatsky made her scorn for traditional forms of Judaism and Christianity explicit, writing that real theosophy, i.e. the theosophy that comes to us from the East, is assuredly pantheism and by no means theism. Tensions between Christian theosophists and the Eastern-looking Theosophical Society eventually led to the formation of several offshoot occult groups that focused primarily on Western traditions, most notably the Hermetic Society and the Anthroposophical Society. Anna Kingsford, 1846 to 1888, formerly an officer in the Theosophical Society, founded the Hermetic Society in 1884. A convert to Roman Catholicism in her 20s, Kingsford enrolled in the Paris Medical School, since women were not allowed to take medical degrees in Britain at the time, and graduated in 1880. A forthright advocate of Pythagoreanism, anti-vivisection, and reincarnation, she penned The Perfect Way in 1882, which claimed to be a new revealed gospel based on her many mystical visions. Kingsford held that the Christian revelation was not higher than those of other religions, and Jesus was not a unique avatar or divine incarnation, a stance that differentiated her from earlier Christian theosophists such as Jacob Boehme and Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin. Her seminal philosophy drew on Christianity, Renaissance magic, Eastern mysticism, and late Victorian feminism. Kingsford joined the Theosophical Society and in 1883 became president of the British Theosophical Society. During the first year of her office, however, her advocacy of a new Christian esotericism led to a simmering rivalry with A.P. Sinnott, another theosophical leader who wanted the Theosophical Society to focus solely on Eastern philosophies. The dissension between the two visions led to Kingsford's quitting of the Theosophical Society. Both spiritual partner Edward Maitland, 1824 to 1897, and the scholar A.E. Waite followed her out of the Theosophical Society and assisted her in founding the Hermetic Society in 1884. Kingsford's seminal work influenced theosophical writers Alice Bailey and C.W. Leadbeater, who later borrowed many of her ideas without crediting her. Annie Besant, 1847 to 1933, joined the Theosophical Society in 1889, impressed by the secret doctrine and inspired by her first encounter with Blavatsky that same year. Besant's life before Theosophy paralleled Kingsford's in many ways. Both were married to Anglican priests, publicly campaigned for social justice causes, and held degrees in science at a time when women rarely pursued such studies. Besant, an honors BSc in botany, and Kingsford, a medical degree. Most importantly, in light of the book's subject, Kingsford and Besant promoted Christian mysticism within the Theosophical Society. Shortly after the election of Annie Besant to the Theosophical Society's presidency in 1907, several British lodges incorporated devotional services in addition to lectures into their weekly programs, among them the West London Lodge. In 1909, the North London Lodge replaced the regular weekly talks with Sunday night services that included music, invocations, ethical hymns, and addresses. Additionally, a Sunday devotional gathering became a regular occurrence at Theosophical Society headquarters in Tavistock Square. Later in this chapter, it will be shown Besant was an early champion of the liberal Catholic Church, and the Theosophical Society's leaning toward more devotional practices during her early presidency presaged the founding and growth of the liberal Catholic Church.